Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. Hello?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Oh, great. Wonderful. Thank you. I'm just hoping that my slideshow is currently up and loaded. I guess I'll just start.
Yes, it is.
Fingers crossed that my slide is up there. Thank you so much. And I'm here to speak in support of the motion in terms of recalibrating the Housing Vancouver strategy post-COVID. And I think that if you hit the next slide, that really what's happened with the Housing Vancouver plan, I think two elements are actually, I think it's a start. That very much there's been, I think, a terms of transparency and terms of accountability, that there has been a release of data that has not been there before in terms of informing the public about what's going on in the environment in terms of housing the city. But I think that similarly, I think that it's a start, and that fundamentally it's building upon this initial start that I think really needs to move forward. And this goes into specific things like how temporary modular housing shouldn't necessarily be just slotted as social housing. And I think that in that name of transparency, that has been sectioned out, but yet at the same time, it's sometimes counted as social housing. And I think it's very clear to come out with very strong definitions of what these various categories are. Next slide, please. And I think that a lot of this is also touching upon really the complete disconnection, as other speakers have talked about, in terms of the disconnection between what's being built and who can afford this versus who actually lives in the city. If you go for this slide that illustrates really the disconnection, or rather disconnection, we find that 66% of what was approved to be built in a year in Vancouver is only really going to be affordable for 40% of its population. And I think that is, highlighting one of the kind of key challenges in terms of this recalibration. Next slide. And I think within this recalibration has actually been the release of more data. You have to remember the Housing Vancouver plan was created in November 2017, and has since there's been a number of major releases in terms of data and research relationships between the federal government and the provincial government. I think all through which create really important sets of information and data sets in terms to incorporate. And I think the first and foremost is the understanding that 46% of the condominiums that were built in Vancouver are actually occupied by non-owners, that their owners don't actually live in that. And I think that is one of the new pieces of information to kind of fit in this entire conversation of what's going on in the Vancouver housing market. And I think that really it's this piece of, I think, new data and new research that I think really has changed since the last 2 years, that you also have to look at existing ones. And of course, the discussion about the future growth of the population really being connected towards immigration really highlights some of the challenges, because we find that immigrants in Vancouver, specifically living in the city of Vancouver, only earn half as much as in terms of a median total income as the non-immigrant population. So I think this entire discussion about how new housing is connected towards housing new immigrants, I think is really, again, one of the major challenges. And really some final comments, and I think that this is really elements through which is really seen in the reports that have come out since the initial 2017 strategy, is really, I think, really clearing up the differences between approvals versus starts and housing completions, and how they're connected, or rather disconnected, in the provision of housing in the city of Vancouver. The discussion of gross versus net numbers, and really, I think, core within this discussion is the loss of affordability in terms of displacement and gentrification, as well as suitability, and that not all demand should necessarily have the same priority in terms of housing, and that housing tenure isn't necessarily the same as affordability, right? That by saying someone is a renter does not necessarily mean that they're living in affordable housing, of course. And that really, for housing in the post-COVID era, we really see that really the issues around biomedical security, adaptability, and flexibility are going to emerge. And that really the core of this is really trying to deal with meeting in the questions of who and where will be as important as how many when we think about housing policy into the future of the city. Thank you.
That was perfectly timed, and you do have some questions. Councillor Hardwick.
Just a point of parliamentary procedure, I just wanted to check in Chair Carr that we are breaking at 5 p.m.
Yes, if we have, if we can just go through the speakers, it's 6 minutes and we have 10 minutes to go. So yes, if people keep to the timing, we're good.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yan, for being here. For those that are not familiar with you, what is your area of expertise, please?
It's in housing, demographics, and geographic information systems.
Would you characterize yourself as a data geek?
I have actually been a provincial expert in the in court talking about housing policy.
So you're an expert, and so you do think that now is a good time to revisit the Housing Vancouver targets?
I think it's an opportunity to refresh a strategy, as there have been, I think, several data sets and new questions that have been, I think, attained over since the original strategy, since the overall strategy was initially developed, and that I think that this is an opportunity to take stock and really reaffirm the principles that this council, as well as this council, wants to pursue.
Do you see any downside in obtaining more and better data in this regard?
I think that there isn't a downside. There's an opportunity to really sharpen policy. I think that there's an opportunity to really, I think, challenge policy that doesn't necessarily been working. And I think that this is really, I think, the opportunity through which good data can provide the foundation for good decisions.
Are there any data sets in particular that you're interested in seeing?
Well, I think the Canadian Housing Statistics Program that was just launched between StatsCan and the Canadian Mortgage, the Canadian Housing Corporation really is one data set. But then I think fundamentally it's actually digging into the city's own data sets that it has and really connecting them, really seeing where they connect or where they disconnect. I think really coming down towards the stock, and I think really having an understanding of the stock of housing in terms of rental, in terms of availability, as presented in previous speakers, that I think presents an opportunity to build a stronger strategy from the one that was originally presented in November 2017.
Now, the November 2017 strategy, of course, came out of the preceding decade, and in particular, I think the year before was 2016. What was remarkable in your examination of the data around 2016 and the years leading up to the foundation of the Housing Vancouver strategy?
Well, I think that what's remarkable. Oh, sure. It's really how much more we know about what was happening in the housing market in the city of Vancouver, whether it comes to non-owner occupancy, foreign ownership, as well as the role of finance, and whether it's global or national finance, really how much those elements have changed even since those few 4 years. And I think that this is the opportunity to make sure that the intentions and the policies this council has can be met in terms of housing.
Terrific. Thank you very much.
That is your time. Just before I move on, you do have other speakers, Mr. Yan. Council, I will need a motion to extend past 5 o'clock to finish this speakers list. So we have two more councillors asking questions. That will be another 6 minutes.
So moved, and then we could recess.
Sure. And then we will recess for dinner for an hour.
Thank you.
So that is the motion. Can I just hear all those in favor of finishing the speakers? I'll say yay.
Favor.
Yay.
Aye.
Any opposed, say nay. Great, thank you. Thank you very much. So Councillor Dominato, you are next with questioning to Mr. Yan.
Thanks, Dr. Yan. Thanks for being here. I wanted to follow up just with respect to the conversation around the existing strategy, and there's a focus on income bands, there's a focus on typology in terms of housing. What other variables do you think that we need to be thinking about or considering?
I think that it's going to come down towards also elements of suitability. That is really the sizes of the units and really how well or not so well towards matching the family sizes that we're talking about. I think really a really important element. I think in part having a background in geography, that is that really the issue of where might this housing be located in terms of the 51 square kilometers of the city. That I think that this is also, we certainly have seen a lot of emphasis on what, but then I think that there is also an equally fair conversation of where. And I think that it's not only about the strategy, but it's also its connections in terms of how it connects up to where, and also the kind of amenities that are going to be needed to support whomever we're trying to house in the city.
I appreciate that. Thanks for adding that. I also just wanted to follow up on your point around non-owners, and I'm just curious, is there a data set out there or to distinguish between overseas owners who've invested in property versus second homeowners, people who may live on the island or in Calgary and have a second home and come to Vancouver and like to spend money in their economy and come for, as more sort of second tourists. Do we have a way of distinguishing between those types of non-owners or owners? Sorry.
I think that there's an opportunity to build that forward in terms of what was presented by the federal government. I also think that there's also an opportunity to really, I think, get a deeper understanding, because of course within that non-owner occupancy is a very complex series of ownerships in terms of units that are being offered for rent, units that are being held as second or third homes, and then really units that are being put forward on the short-term rental market. And that right now, at this point, it's all mixed together.
Yeah, no, I think it's helpful to understand that. And I just want to say, I also appreciated your comment around the opportunity to refresh the strategy. That's the world I come from, is strategy development. And often I think that's something we need to think about, is that a strategy isn't, you develop it in a certain point in time, but it can't be locked down. You have to be nimble and fluid and adjust as the circumstances around you change. And it doesn't necessarily apply just to housing. So thank you. Appreciate that comment.
Great. Thank you, Councillor Dominato. Mayor Stewart, go ahead with your questions.
Hello. Thanks for coming in this evening and sharing your thoughts on this. I have an initial simple question. Do you think we have just too much darn housing in Vancouver?
Well, it's the question of who are we trying to house? I'd like to kind of begin that question of not only how many units, but who are we trying to house? I think as we've seen over the last seven weeks, we've certainly seen that there are so many people living in the city right now who are homeless, who are underhoused, that I think goes into the question of the right supply, through which it has been one of the principles of this strategy. And I think, again, it's the opportunity to recalibrate that question.
And so just following on that, how would you suggest we recalibrate it? We have, this current plan is 72,000 units over 10 years that we're not even close to hitting. Some folks are suggesting we cut it down to 60,000 units. What's your magic number?
Well, I'm really terrible at magic. Nobody really shows up to my party tricks. I'm pretty bad at it, and I think that part of this, I think, is actually an understanding of actually how that 72,000 breaks down, through which actually I think the latest data book does offer that breakdown. But then it's also just a transparent process in terms of understanding really how did we get to that 72,000? Is it appropriate? Is it, why? For example, I'm always suspect about coming down with one definite number like 72,000. I think with the ideas of estimates and uncertainty, why wasn't it a band in terms of being somewhere between, say, 65,000 or 80,000, and really show your work? And I think that that's really what the opportunity is really showing the work that is involved. And I'm quite sure that staff works pretty hard in the city of Vancouver. And I think this is the opportunity to kind of show how hard they work.
So just focusing on your right supplies response, who do you think is going to build housing for folks that families that make, say, under $50,000 a year?
I think that that's one of the big questions moving forward is who can, because we've certainly seen what the existing housing system has been able to produce, as well as not produce in terms of who can afford it. And I think that that is one of the major challenges in a place like Vancouver, as well as other cities around North America. But one should also note that Vancouver seems to have a particularly acute problem in this.
Okay, thanks very much. That's my 3 minutes.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Mayor Stewart. And Councillor Kirby-Young. Councillor Kirby-Young, you may be on mute. We're still not hearing you, Councillor Kirby-Young. Madam Clerk has been in a difficulty in reaching Councillor Kirby-Young.
Councillor Kirby-Young, are you on the line?
You know,
I
she
hear
sounds like she's
something.
very faint. Yeah, I do too.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, that is better. Thank you. Go ahead with your questions.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Mr. Yan, for being here. I was compelled to ask you questions, just following up on Mayor Stewart's questions. And I see that you laughed when he said, you know, do we have enough housing in Vancouver? And then he went to say who's going to build the right supply and the right type. It seemed a bit sad and defeatist comment. I mean, do you think we have to try?
Point of order, Chair. Point of order.
Yes,
I think characterizing my comments violate the procedure, bylaw 6.1. Is that, that's impugning my motives.
Yes, I would agree with you. Councillor Kirby-Young, if you could not impugn or mischaracterize individuals, I think you would just stick to the content here, please.
Yeah, let me try to reframe. I was trying to focus on the comment, being said. But I think, Mr. Yan, do you think it's a little bit more nuanced in the approach that the City of Vancouver has to take? It's not just the number of units. There's some qualitative factors and as well as quantitative ones that need to come in terms of a balanced consideration. So is household size changing, for example? Are we building multi-family dwellings? And I guess my question is going towards, do you think that there are things that the city can do in terms of policies and zoning? You know, our 60% of our land is zoned for single family use. Or for example, we heard today that it's about 12 months on average for rezoning. Would it make a difference if it to the market, if it was 6 months for rezoning to do a purpose-built rental and it was 12 or 18 months if you were doing strata and you were put in a different queue? Can you comment on that?
Well, I think that it's interesting to kind of see if you're able to streamline these processes, whether the builder will pass on those savings to the prospective tenant. I think that in this motion we're predominantly talking about data, housing data, and that when it comes to policy, I think there's any number of myriad ways of really up to approaching your question. I think that a really perfect example is actually the kind of income, and I think that there has been a big focus on income, but then there are of course many different I think elements of what informs housing, the development of housing. But that really, I think the practice of just offering citywide numbers in terms of building these targets, I think really doesn't necessarily deal with some of the practices that I know, which is actually dealing with area median income.
And can you elaborate on that in terms of the income piece?
Really, how does that begin to house those who are living in these respective neighborhoods in Vancouver, and really what might those types of different housing units look like when we take in things like area median income as opposed to just a general citywide numbers.
Okay, so potentially looking at a more nuanced approach by neighborhoods, recognizing there's different disparity of income and that across parts of the city, for example.
And very much so. And you got to remember that within Vancouver neighborhoods, particularly outside of the downtown core, we're talking about several $1 billion worth of family supportive amenities, and that really what might be some of those new policies to take advantage of those those amenities, and really I think making sure that they're efficient, but then also inclusive of the diverse population that I think we want to have in the city.
And can you share with us?
Excuse me, Councillor Kirby-Young, I'm afraid you are out of time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Young.
Okay.
Oh,
And thank
my
you,
pleasure.
Mr. Yan. I very much appreciate, as always, your coming to council and providing us with information and your views. So
My
thank you,
pleasure.
and it is that's it, council, for speakers.